You can raise your hand if you want, but how many of you have been to visit Crazy Horse Memorial in the Black Hills? I know we went years ago. We drove by it recently. I think when we went last year, we didn't go actually to the visitor center or anything, but we drove by where you could see it. It's a pretty amazing sight. I don't know if you've had a chance to go down and look around. Maybe you can see Mount Rushmore nearby, and that's an amazing structure as well. But the Crazy Horse Memorial is going to be much more massive even than Mount Rushmore. Um, however, I was curious. You don't have to answer this, but I'm pretty sure it's true about what was most memorable about Crazy Horse to you. For me, it was the fact that it was not done. That was the fact. And I'm not saying that to make fun of it. It is a massive structure. When you realize, I think they would tell you when you're there that all of Mount Rushmore can fit pretty much right there under his arm. So this is a massive structure. It's just that much larger than most other sculptures. But most of the people that I've talked to that visit Crazy Horse, a lot of times our family or friends that are from the south, if they've come up to visit us, might swing by the Black Hills on the way home to visit the Mount Rushmore and Crazy Horse, and that's almost always the thing that they'll say is, "Wow, that was amazing," but it's not even near done. It's not completed yet. In fact, you may have learned if you ever went there and kind of went to the visitor center and looked around that it's been under construction now for over 70 years. It was started in 1948. There was a famous sculptor who actually had worked some on Mount Rushmore and then left and was going to help the tribe there at Pine Ridge. They wanted to make a memorial to Crazy Horse, and he was very on board of that, was very interested in it, and so he began work by himself, oftentimes working only by himself for many years. But what was most interesting to me about this, and again, it's a massive structure. You and I can't imagine doing that kind of work. For one thing, we couldn't even sculpt a little one, right? Much less a large one. But Korczak, the sculptor here, originally thought that this was a huge job. It was a massive undertaking, and he thought it would take him 30 years. And it has now taken 70 years, and I don't know what percent completion they would call it, but it's under half, under 50% complete, even now. There are a lot of similar examples to this, monuments and buildings in history, and ambitious projects begun by visionary people like Korczak, the sculptor here, that have never been completed in their lifetime and may never be completed at all. Although Crazy Horse, they continually to tell us, is definitely still moving. There's not a massive team that's working on it, but it is still being worked on, and they definitely anticipate it being completed one day, but probably many, many years in the future still. Usually, these kind of visionaries that have a dream of doing a great project, building a great monument, or constructing a huge building, there are so many of them that cannot develop a plan to get their project complete. Or maybe, like Korczak, they realize that though they can map it out, the cost of the work, the cost of construction, both in money and in hours, is just way greater than any of their estimates had been. Today, Jesus is going to address this issue of counting the cost, not just building a building or memorial, but of being his disciple, that there is a cost. And these are bracing words that Jesus has for the people that wanted to follow him. Look with me at Luke chapter 14 if you have your Bible this morning. That's where we're going to continue reading. We've been studying through the book of Luke, and you can join us there. Luke chapter 14, we'll start there in verse 25, and you can follow along. It says, "Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them, 'If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, This man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king, going out to encounter another king in war, will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use, either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. These are some of the most challenging words of Jesus. We need to take some time this morning to consider what Jesus is saying. This was a time, if you remember, we've been talking about this in the book of Luke, that this is a time that in Jesus' ministry where he was followed by great crowds. It tells us that here at the beginning of this passage in verse 25. But if you were to go back to chapter 12, verse 1, it tells us that many thousands were in the crowds at these points. So Jesus now is on his final journey towards Jerusalem. He's making his way towards Jerusalem for the final time when he will be arrested, he will be crucified. Jesus knows what is coming. He has actually warned his disciples about what will happen. He's not going into a trap that's been set for him that he doesn't know about. He is purposely going to lay down his life according to God's will for him. So this is all according to his plan. And during this time, great crowds are coming, many thousands at this point. We also know, as we've been studying these last couple of chapters, that this is also a time of great conflict with Jesus' opponents. Not everybody liked the things that Jesus said. In fact, there were a great many people that disliked what he said enough to put him to death, not many months after these words. So there are people in this crowd who are opposed to what Jesus is teaching, and they have actually come to some pretty harsh words. The Pharisees have said to Jesus, when he cast a demon out of somebody, they've said to him, "You're casting out demons because you're the prince of demons." And Jesus would later say to them, "You guys are like unmarked graves." People walk over and don't even know there's a dead person under there. Their conflict had gotten to a pretty obvious level at this point. It was no longer a silent conflict where the Pharisees would sit in their minds and thinking, who does this guy think he is that he can forgive sins? But now they're challenging him in public. And sometimes Jesus has to respond in public to set the record straight. I want you also to remember as we read this and as Jesus is saying to people, look, unless you hate your father and mother, unless you renounce all that you have, you cannot be my disciple. I want you to set this in context. We're only reading one passage this morning, but remember that Jesus looked on the crowds and had compassion on them like sheep without a shepherd. That was his view of the crowds. And we looked just one chapter before this, that when Jesus considered the city of Jerusalem, he wept over it and said, would that you had known the time of your salvation. So when Jesus sees the crowds, he's not looking at them with an angry glare in his eye. He's not trying to repulse them from him and push them away, but he is wanting to be realistic with them. His previous parable here about the master who had given a big feast and invited many people, and those who had received invitations refused to come. So instead, the master went out, he invited the poor, the blind, the lame, even the people in the highways and hedges he invited in, and the purpose was that his house may be filled. So as you read this, understand Jesus is being realistic with us. He's making us aware that there is a cost of following him. However, don't get in your mind that this is said with a harsh attitude or that Jesus doesn't want anyone to follow him. He's just said his desire is that his house would be filled. Still, Jesus makes himself very clear in these verses that following him is a choice of self-sacrifice. I want to deal with something, first of all, as we begin looking at these first couple of verses. This is very important, and I hope that you take it seriously. If you take God's word seriously, these words should make you a little uncomfortable. They're this close to being incorrect. In other words, Jesus has walked right up to the line and said, I want you to be uncomfortable right now because I've got something important to tell you. I was talking to a new believer last year who's very early in his walk, but he was hungry to read the scriptures. And when he came to this passage, he was deeply troubled. He wanted to know, he said, I need to know what this means. He said, look, I'm all in to follow Jesus, but this is serious stuff. I need to know what this means. And I realized at that point, man, he's serious. He takes Jesus' words seriously. So let's ask ourselves the big question, kind of the elephant in the room question. Is Jesus telling us to hate our family? What does he say here? He says at the very beginning, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. We need to understand what Jesus is saying. First of all, you should understand that Jesus never contradicts himself. So we need to go back to the many times in the Gospels, multiple times, when Jesus repeated the commandment to honor your father and your mother. When he was asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said, well, keep the commandments. And they said, well, which ones? And he repeated, honor your father and your mother. In fact, he even criticized the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 15 for saying that they kept that commandment, but not actually keeping it in spirit. So he took that very seriously. Jesus believed you should honor your father and mother according to the commandments. First commandment with promise: honor your father and your mother, that it may go well with you and you may live long in the land that the Lord your God is giving to you. This is a serious commandment. Jesus took it seriously. He reiterated it. The New Testament is also clear in multiple places that the believer, the Christian, should provide for his household first. He said, look, if you don't provide for your household, you're worse than an unbeliever. Then you don't care for your children, you don't provide for your wife. Not only that, but Ephesians chapter 5, that helps us understand how Christians relate to one another in the family, is very clear that we should love one another. Specifically, wives and husbands and children and parents, they should love one another. And in fact, it says that husbands are to love their wives as Christ loved the church. So I'm telling you this to help you understand that, knowing what the Scripture says, we know that the word hate here cannot simply mean the opposite of love. Right? It can't mean the opposite of love, or Jesus would be contradicting himself. If Jesus has said, honor your father and mother, then when he says, if you don't hate your father and mother, then you cannot be my disciple, hate must not mean the opposite of love, because then they would be clearly contradictory. It must mean something other than the opposite of love. And what I'm here to tell you is that it is meant to be comparative. He's using hate in a way that is comparative. This is the way Jesus described it at another time in Matthew chapter 10, when he said something very similar. He said, whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. You understand that Jesus is here saying something that means exactly the same, simply used different words, and had a slightly different audience when he did it. But Jesus is using the word hate in a comparative way. All other loves in our life have to be so much less than our love for Jesus that it is as if they are hate. Does that make sense? He is saying your love for me must be to such an extent that the only way to describe your love that you have for your family would be hate. Not that it's the opposite of love, but comparatively, in quantity, it is so much different. It is so far apart. Does that make sense? Do you understand the reasoning behind Jesus using this terminology? Significantly, I think, Jesus even commands us to hate our own life. I think that's just very important. This isn't about suicide. It's not about self-harm. Notice he said life, not body. There are many religions and many people through different disorders that would say, I don't like my body, or I don't like who I am. I don't like my life, my flesh. They might even do self-harm or contemplate suicide. That's not what Jesus is suggesting. In fact, Ephesians 5:29 tells us no one ever hated their own body, but nourishes and cherishes it just as Christ does the church. The Bible takes that to be an axiom. It takes it to be a general truth that a mentally healthy person will take care of their body. And that if we're tempted not to do that, we're not doing that out of a place of health. We're not doing that out of a place of true connection with God in a good spiritually healthy place. Inflicting self-harm, contemplating suicide, those are demonic temptations. Those are the results of an unhealthy mind, not a healthy mind. So that's not what Jesus is saying here. He's not saying that you would hate your body. What he is saying is that we should not value our life to such a level that we would count our own will or our own desires for our life above Christ's desire for my life. One writer said that martyrdom should be an ever-present possibility to the Christian. Not to be courted, but not to be shunned. Martyrdom is when you give your life up for Christ. This is exactly what Jesus is saying. He's saying that the one who would follow me is willing to give his life up for me. In fact, every Christian has to be ready for martyrdom. You say, I hope not. There are Christians in the world today who are actually being killed for their faith. We're so thankful that God has given us freedom. He's given us such peace as believers that we don't see that as a real possibility for us most days. But did you know it is a real possibility for us that, spiritually speaking, we have to be martyrs to be a Christian. We have to die to ourselves. We have to give up our own self-will. Isn't that what Paul said when he said in 1 Corinthians 15, I die every day? This isn't some sort of weird sci-fi plot. This isn't Groundhog Day. He's saying spiritually, I surrender my life to Christ every day. I'm no longer in control of it. The part of me that says I get to choose what I want to do, I've put to death. And I've given the controls, the steering wheel, over to God. Paul would say in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 that we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake. That's tough news for us as Christians. He said, look, we're dying to ourselves every day for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. Paul says that as Christians, we're walking around saying, hey, the old me is dead. The living thing that you see now is Jesus living through me. That's who I am now. Galatians 2:20, Paul said, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. He said, I've been crucified. The me that says I'm in charge, that says I'm in control of my life, has been executed, put to death. And Jesus is now in charge. If you think Jesus couldn't possibly have meant this same idea, when he was speaking, notice that even he even told the crowds that to be his disciple, you must bear your own cross. Jesus had already told his disciples this. If you were to look back back in chapter 9, verse 23 in Luke, you'll notice that Jesus had already told his disciples that you have to bear your cross. But I want you to think about the crowds at this point. It's difficult to get your mind back in the setting of that time, but understand that we know what the cross is today. We have people maybe this morning that are wearing a cross somewhere as an indication, hey, I'm a Christian, I follow Jesus. That's great. We might have crosses in the building here. You might have a cross on your wall at home. Because for us, it's a reminder now of Jesus' love. But understand, put yourself back before Jesus has been crucified. This cross that he's speaking about is just a form of execution. No one has ever thought before this that a cross would be a good thing at all. So imagine a noose. And that's not what Jesus said, but just let me get your imagination here. Imagine if Jesus had said, if you want to be my disciple, pick up a noose and carry it with me. Or take the image of the electric chair and carry that with me. That's what it takes to be a disciple. You see how shocking that is? That for these listeners, they would have said, say that again, Jesus? Takes what to be your disciple? To bear your own cross? Why are we talking about a death here? Why are we talking about an execution? But Jesus is telling the crowds, no, there is going to have to be a death. And Jesus' meaning here is twofold. He is foreshadowing his own death on the cross, but he is also telling you and I that we have to die to ourselves. We have to give up control of our lives. Jesus' challenge here is not meant to be repulsive, but realistic. He would have us be fully aware of the significance of what it costs for us to be saved from our sins. Think about the two examples that Jesus uses here. Number one, he says, the greater the work, the greater the cost. The story here about the tower is meant to be obvious. That's why he says, which one of you? This is something that all of us should be able to answer. He says, yeah, who can imagine someone who's going to build a tower, a large building, who doesn't sit down ahead of time and count out the costs? Now, I don't do construction professionally. However, I kind of grew up around it all my life, and I went to school and learned about construction, so I've been kind of in and out of the industry. Most conflict in construction has to do with unrealistic expectations of cost. That's the textbook explanation. The real-life explanation is, well, how did I get this big bill? That's when the conflict in construction comes, right? When you're partway through the project and the owner says, well, how did we get so expensive? And the builder says, well, remember those 10 times when you came and said, hey, can we have marble instead of composite countertops? And you said, sure. And can we have porcelain appliances in the bathroom instead of plastic? And he said, sure. And all those decisions that you made, well, all of those cost more, right? So this is where conflict in construction comes. And evidently, it's been that way throughout history. Jesus says, which one of you, if you're going to build this big building, wouldn't sit down ahead of time and figure out how much it's going to cost An example is because otherwise you would build the foundation and then not have enough to complete the work, and people would laugh at you. Now, this is interesting. You know this. This is obvious. It almost doesn't need to be said, but it's funny to think about it. You know, you can't start with the second story, right? Even if you're going to, and people, this happens in construction all the time too, right? Did you know that oftentimes 15 to 20% of your building costs will go into your foundation? You have someone that wants to build a house and they calculate how much it's going to cost, and you're going to bill them monthly or quarterly, and the contractor gets to work, and here they are 6 months into the job, and all they have is this muddy hole in the ground with a little bit of concrete poured around, and already they're out 20% of their whole cost. And you can see them get a shocked look in their eye. How are we going to have any money left for the rest, right? You have to explain to them that's what it costs to build a foundation. You can't start with the second story. You have to start with the foundation all the time. So Jesus says, look, there's no way if you're going to build a building that you're going to get the second story done and then not have enough money. What you're going to have is a foundation in the ground and not enough money to finish. It's interesting that Jesus used this idea of a foundation. Jesus himself, at this point, was laying the foundation for our salvation. Look what the New Testament will later say about this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul will say, no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. At this moment when Jesus is speaking, he is laying the foundation for us to be saved. He's living a sinless life. He's on his way to die a sinner's death, even though he lived a sinless life. He is laying the foundation for our faith. Ephesians chapter 2 says that we as believers are built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone. That Jesus himself is at this point in the book of Luke laying the foundation upon which our salvation, our forgiveness is built. But there's a sense in which that foundation has to be laid in our own lives as well. Remember, when Jesus spoke about a foundation, he told this parable in the Sermon on the Mount. He talks about those who would hear his words and listen to them and do them. And he says, those that hear my words and do them are like the wise person that built his house on a foundation of rock, so that when the difficult times come, when the floods came, it would not be moved. But those who listened to my words and did not do them, did not obey them, didn't have a firm foundation. When the floods came, that house was leveled, was destroyed. It's interesting to think even about Jesus' example here, that we don't do the work of saving ourselves, but we do have to count the cost. There is a cost to salvation. This is not some sort of roadway sale sign where we're trying to get people to say, hey, look, there's the salvation that you can have free, no money down, no payments for the next 60 months. Here's salvation. It's easy to get. There is a huge cost to be forgiven. Our sin has mounted up against us as a massive debt. There is a great cost. Do you think that becoming a Christian is a simple decision? I'll tell you right now that I'm very concerned with anyone who says, I want to be a Christian, but isn't emotional about it, isn't moved, isn't stirred about it. I'm not sure you understand. I can't know your heart. I don't know that for sure, but I'm not sure that you do. It's a massive decision. There is a huge cost. Not only the greater the work, the greater the cost, but the greater the danger, the greater the urgency. Jesus tells the second story about the king who's going to go to battle. You know, we may love stories about the reckless hero who runs into battle against overwhelming odds and wins, but the truth is, throughout history, most of those stories don't win. That hero story is by far the great outlier. Most of the time, the odds are what determines the battle. Jesus talks about this king who is going to have to go to war with another king. And he realizes that he has 10,000 troops. His opponent has 20,000. He's outnumbered 2 to 1. Some people have fought battles in those scenarios, but this king realizes, because of where the battle will be, because of what the odds are, he can't win. Again, I think we're tempted to say, yeah, but if he were a hero, he'd say, we can win no matter what the odds. But just consider, the king loves his people. If the king loses the battle, his empire is gone, right? There's a lot that's involved here. He doesn't get to just say, me personally, well, I'd like to see us give it the old college try, and if we lose, too bad. There's a lot of responsibility on a king's shoulders. He represents his whole nation. He represents the safety of all the people that are under his administration. And this king works out the math. He studies the strategy, and he says, we can't win this one, guys. There's no coming out of this one on top. And Jesus' example says, what kind of king would not know that and then immediately get his fastest courier, his swiftest messenger, and start sending messages to the other kings saying, hey, how can we reach a deal? Whatever it takes, you name the price, but let's get a peace agreement settled. Do we really understand the danger that our souls are in? So again, you may look at Jesus' example of the king and say, hey, 2-to-1 aren't so bad. I heard of a battle where people won against 2-to-1 odds. But no, consider, the king has worked out the strategy. He cannot win. He will not win. The whole kingdom is at danger. All the people are in danger. And he decides we must seek peace. What kind of danger are our souls in? Remember in Luke chapter 13, just some verses before this, Jesus is telling a parable. And the master of that house where the door was shut says, I tell you, I do not know where you come from. Depart from me, you workers of evil. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. You know, all of our descriptions of the punishment of hell come from Jesus. You know that's where they come from? Not because Jesus is interested in and enjoys the thought of people going to hell, just the opposite. He wants us to know that there is a punishment that awaits our sin. He doesn't want anyone to go there. But he tells us the truth. The danger that our souls are in is great. And Jesus' example here is not only tell us the greater the work, the greater the cost, that's true, but the greater the danger, the greater the urgency. Something must be done. The king in this instance decides, I must have peace. He immediately sends his courier, sends his message saying, let's make peace. If you really understood the danger your soul was in because of your own sin, you would be anxious to seek for peace. Jesus wanted these great crowds that were following him at this point to know that to really follow him was not one choice among several good options. It was the only choice. Again, back up to this example. I know some of us history folks are going to try to say, but hey, I know a battle one time where they won 2-to-1. But no. Jesus' example is simple. He says he cannot win. He can't succeed. The king reaches the conclusion, we will not win. At that point, how many options does he have? One option. If I don't make peace, we're doomed. You understand that this is where you and I are at in our sin. When we come to fully understand my sin, I realize I have one option, and that is to beg God for peace. I have got to find a way for God to grant me forgiveness. Truthfully, I think Jesus' point is that you can only choose to follow him by faith. Look at verse 33. I think this is an important verse. Verse 33 is a summary. It's a summary both of Jesus' examples, the example of the building, the example of the king, and it's a summary of his initial teaching as well, verses 26 and 27. This is now the third time in this passage that Jesus has emphasized that unless you have some quality, unless you have something, you cannot be my disciple. It's the third time he said, unless you, then you cannot be my disciple. And we know from the New Testament what that quality is. That quality that Jesus is looking for, with which if you do not have, you cannot be his disciple. That quality is what the New Testament calls faith. That is the key ingredient. That is what you must have. With that, you can be his disciple. Without that, you cannot be his disciple. Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and he rewards those who diligently seek him. Hebrews chapter 11 tells us all about faith. It explains the importance of faith in the Old Testament, how all the heroes in the Old Testament trusted God through faith. This is that missing ingredient. If you don't have it, you cannot be his disciple, he says. Romans 3:22, Paul says, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ. That we receive righteousness from God through faith in Jesus Christ. That's the missing ingredient. That's the thing you have to have if you will be his disciple. Ephesians 2:8, by grace you have been saved through faith. Without this, you cannot be my disciple. And that is exactly what Jesus is teaching in the word that we find here in verse 33, renounce. I don't like that word. I'm not arguing with the translation. I understand it's an acceptable word, but for me at least, the way I speak, it doesn't sound like a word that I understand very well. To renounce means to speak against. In the King James, it used to say, likewise, whosoever he be of you that forsaketh not all that he hath. That you have to forsake everything. Does that help a little bit? Or how about this? One expert on the Greek language said this word for renounce really means to bid goodbye. So in essence, you may say that Jesus is saying that unless you are willing to kiss everything you have goodbye, you cannot be my disciple. This is what he means by renounce. Years ago, we took a class in evangelism, and they used this definition for faith that we would share with people many times. Forsaking all, I trust him. I didn't make that up, by the way. I just want you to know I'm not taking credit for that. I didn't invent that. I learned that, and I've used it many times in explaining to someone what faith means. And it's a great reminder. You can remember the word faith, and this is exactly what Jesus is saying in this passage. It's exactly what he's summarizing in verse 33. He doesn't use the word faith, and you can say, well, look, Jesus never says faith is necessary. No, he doesn't, but he uses the definition. That is, forsaking, right? Renouncing all that he has. Forsaking all, I trust him. This is the driving force behind Jesus' statement that we must hate our family and even our own life. Jesus is making the point that real faith, genuine saving faith, is saying, I have trust in nothing else. I have put everything else aside. I have forsaken everything else to trust Jesus. Paul would sum it up in his own life when he was writing to the Philippians. He said, whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. That's a great way of describing it. Indeed, I count everything as lost because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which comes through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God that depends on faith. This is Paul describing exactly what Jesus is saying, right? He's saying, I have forsaken all things. I've counted everything that I could have had as lost, garbage. Put all my money, so to speak, on Jesus. I put all that I have on trusting Jesus. As you think about this morning, again, don't make it me trying to bring the heavy words of Jesus. Let Jesus bring the heavy words. Maybe you're here this morning and you're already a Christian. Let me just ask you. Don't say it out loud, but you need to seriously consider. What have you had to bid goodbye to be a Christian? Jesus says, unless we have that quality, we cannot be his disciple. What have you had to kiss goodbye in order to be a Christian? It may sound like something dramatic to other people. It may not. I don't know. I'm not challenging you on what it is. I'm just saying you got to have a list of some sort. That I have kissed this goodbye. I gave it up. And I'm not talking just about things, although that might have been the beginning for you. Many people have said, well, there was this habit, or there was this relationship, or there was something that Jesus said, well, look, if you're going to trust in that, you cannot be my disciple. I had to kiss it goodbye. I had to shun that. It could be. But there's something much deeper than that. There's even control of your own life. That you might have had to give up your plans for your future. You might have said, well, this was my dream. This is what I was going to do. But Jesus said, yeah, but I'm going to give you new dreams. They're my dreams for your life, not yours. Challenging you. If you're going to say that you're a Christian, you should be able to come up with, not for me, but I'm asking you to come up for yourself so that you know what is the list of things that you can say, this I have forsaken. I have given up for Jesus. Maybe let me ask you this. Is there something that you need to forsake today? Has your relationship with God been getting more and more uncomfortable? And now you're realizing it's because you've been left with one thing that you're holding on to saying, yeah, but I didn't want to have to give up this. And Jesus is here saying to us, no, it's all. Unless you're willing to renounce all that you have, forsake all that you have, you cannot be my disciple. This passage concludes with a shift in the imagery. Jesus kind of switches gears really quickly, and he suddenly starts talking about salt. Salt was a valuable commodity in Jesus' day. It's been a valuable commodity throughout history. In a lot of ways, in Jesus' day, it would have been considered kind of an elemental product. We know today that it's combined. It's what you get whenever you put an acid and a base together. You get a salt. But we're talking about salt that you would put on your food. That's a preservative that was so useful in Jesus' day. That's an antiseptic in some instances. It's so very useful in Jesus' day. And for them, salt was kind of an elemental product. It could not be replicated. It could not be copied. If you needed salt, you needed salt. There was nothing else that you could put in that position. They didn't have a range of chemicals you could go to in the cleaning aisle at the store or in the health aisle at the store to replace all the uses they used salt for. It was either you needed salt or you didn't have another answer. There was no substitute for it. There was no way to obtain it other than the laborious process of collecting it or of mining it. The question that Jesus is raising here at the end of this passage is, what do you call salt that does not have the characteristics of salt? Specifically the taste. He said, what is it that you can call that if it doesn't act and behave and look like and work like salt? And Jesus says you would call it garbage. That's what you would call it. I'm going to encourage you this morning that if you're truly a Christian, then stay salty. I mean, stay true to your characteristics. Do you understand what I'm saying about salt? I think this is easy to miss. I don't think talking about it more and more and more will make it even better. Jesus says it. I think it's fairly clear. This is not the only time that Jesus used the image of salt to teach. In Matthew chapter 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, he said to his disciples, "You are the salt of the earth." So he said that those of us who follow him are supposed to be the salt of the earth. That's why when now he says very plainly, salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall it be restored? We're supposed to know who he's talking about. He's already told his disciples, you are the salt of the earth. So he says, okay, salt is good. You're good. But if you no longer have the characteristics of salt, what do we call you? This is true if we're going to be the followers of Jesus. We say, I am a Christian, or I am a follower of Jesus. And the question becomes, what do we call the person who says they're a Christian if they don't have the characteristics of a Christian? What do we call somebody who says they're a follower of Jesus if they don't have the characteristics of a follower of Jesus? If they don't taste like and look like and smell like and act like, what then do we call them? And I think really the point is here not so much that they are garbage, but that they don't exist. Jesus is saying, look, this is a hypothetical. If salt were to lose its flavor, and he's saying, well, there would be no use for it. What would you call it? You wouldn't call it anything. There is no term for it. If it's not salty, it's not salt. You can call it sand, you can call it garbage, you can call it anything you want. But it's not salt anymore. It's not salty. And the challenge is clear here. That if we are really followers of Jesus, our lives will be conformed to that pattern. Now let's be clear. We're going to immediately say to each other, well, yeah, but not all the time. We all have failings. Nobody's perfect. All of those things are true. Don't get the picture here that I'm expecting or that I've set some sort of standard, some sort of card that I measure up people when I see them on the street and say, yeah, it's not really a Christian. Yeah, they're not really a Christian. No, for one thing, that's not my job, and it's not your job either. Your job is for you, though. And the question is, do you have the characteristics of a follower of Jesus? What a terrible thing it would be for us to one day be at the judgment of God himself, and for us to have the big label on us that we've written that says Christian, or the big cross around our neck or the big expectation, I'm a Christian. And God says, doesn't smell like, doesn't look like, doesn't act like Christian. I don't know where you got the label, but that's not what we call that here. Jesus' words are clear. He looks at the great crowd and he says to them, unless you're willing to give it all up for me, you cannot be my disciple. This morning as we close, I want to challenge each one of us. If you say that you're a Christian, what have you given up for him? I'm not saying that because I think you are. I'm just saying I think you would benefit greatly thinking through. These are the things I gave up. Maybe even you've been bitter about it. It's possible that you're a Christian and you've still been bitter because God asked you to give something up for him. And maybe writing it down or at least praying through it with him will help you not be bitter anymore. And instead be able to say, you know what? I'm glad I gave that. I've been holding that against God all this time, but I actually am glad I gave it up. Following him is so much better anyway. I'm so thankful that I gave that to him. Maybe you'll realize there's something in your life right now that God is saying, hey, look, I thought you told me you were going to give up everything for me. Why are you hanging on to this habit or this relationship or this idea of who you need to be or what your future is? Why don't you just give that up and let me tell you who you need to be, what your future needs to be? Maybe you're here this morning and you're not a Christian. You're realizing, I don't act like a Christian, not in my heart. I may even have everybody else around me fooled. I look really squeaky clean on the outside, but in my heart, I know that I'm not salty. I'm not really a Christian. Well, then you need to trust Jesus by faith this morning. It's not a work that you do, it's a surrendering. Simply saying, okay, God, I give up. I like that picture that Jesus painted about the king going to war. We don't usually like examples about surrendering, but Jesus uses one about surrendering. And that's what it takes to become a Christian. Even this morning, you can surrender to Jesus, saying, okay, God, I need your salvation. Will you forgive me and save me?